Rocking the Classics. I'm going to attempt to review this book outlining the English progressive rock and counterculture phenomena. It's by Edward Machen. It's quite a good book. Anyone who's into progressive rock, I strongly recommend that you have a look at this book if you want to get a deeper understanding of the music that you're listening to, the origins of the music you listen to, what happened to the music that you listen to. It's quite interesting. This is something that I managed to pick up, and basically it's a genealogy of progressive rock. The top of it outlines the kind of musical styles that came together that form progressive rock. Rock music of the early 60s, bands like The Who were quite influential. The Kinks, with their use of electric guitars, amplification, folk music, early English 60s folk music, quite influential on people like Jimmy Page, for example. Stairway to Heaven's almost copied from some examples. Classical music, Emerson, Lake and Palmer definitely influenced by classical music. The Moody Blues, classical music, Procol Harum, Wider Shade of Pale, definitely a Bach, Baroque kind of thing. Jazz, a lot of the drumming is influenced by the jazz drummers like Alvin Jones. The extended instrumental solos originate from the modal jazz of Ornette Coleman, avant-garde jazz, avant-garde music, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, the Minimalists, definitely John Cale from the Velvet Underground comes from this background. So we have a hodgepodge of styles. Edward Machen in his book says that, it's upside down, that there were several waves of music in the mid-60s. One was more blues-orientated, kind of heavy jamming, blues-orientated music, Jimi Hendrix, Cream, those types of bands that ended up progressing into Led Zeppelin and heavy rock bands like Black Sabbath. Then we have symphonic kinds of music. The Beatles had symphonic elements in their pop songs. The Moody Blues extended that into almost being classical music, but in the form of a song which probably had kind of folk leanings. Very influential. Ian MacDonald from King Crimson, in the Court of the Crimson King's virtual progression of what the Moody Blues were doing, but in a much more intense and complicated manner. The symphonic kind of thing moved into some of what Yes and Genesis were doing. This diagram here, that would be defined as what you call classic prog. Classic prog is basically archetypal prog, Yes, Genesis, focus even. Classical prog is more where they're virtually plagiarizing the work of classical musicians like Bach and Mozart and Beethoven. Keith Emerson was notorious for this. Rick Wakeman in his solo albums very much virtually a form of classical music with electronic instruments. Then we have what he defines as folk prog. Folk prog is Jethro Tull, Renaissance, The Strawbs, Fairport Convention. Hard prog, very hard to define King Crimson, because they basically, on islands there's classical prog, so in the Seagulls, and on Lizard, there's Bolero, that's classical prog. Hard prog would probably be in Lux, Tons and Aspect and 21st Century Schizoid Man. He's defining here, the author of this anonymous person, Van de Graaff Generator in that category, and also putting Atomic Rooster in there. I wouldn't agree with Atomic Rooster being in there, or the definition of hard prog. I would find it hard to define what Van de Graaff Generator were. They virtually are a branch on their own. They virtually don't seem to be influenced by anyone, and no one else seems to be able to do what they did. Also with the Lark's Tongues and Aspect, King Crimson, that's a genre on its own. Then we get Continental Prog, which is basically a lot of Italian bands like PFM, who were very influenced by what was happening in England, very fond of bands like Genesis and Van de Graaff Generator. They formed their own style of progressive rock. PFM albums are quite interesting. According to this, bands like Supertramp and Roxy Music, 10cc, even Alan Parsons, don't come under the real term progressive rock, rather art rock form. A lot of glam rock, a lot of pop influences in the music. Supertramp is virtually an English version of Steely Dan. Lots of jazzy stuff, but not your Ornette Coleman, more like your 40s jazz, like swing jazz, lots of bluesy stuff. Not really a modern-y thing. From there, according to this book, bands like Rush. Now, I have a real problem with bands like Rush, and Edward agrees with me, and they don't get included in what you'd call progressive rock. He calls them prog. In this here, Edward Mackin calls it stadium rock. These are bands that were influenced by the virtuosity of symphonic and hardcore progressive rock bands from England, but the flavour of them is very much an American thing. You can hear the American influences in the music. Progressive rock music to me is an English phenomena. It's not done well by American bands. They just don't sound right. Progressing from there, we have progressive metal, and then interestingly enough, the Canterbury scene. That's an interesting form of prog rock, which basically married itself with jazz, and unfortunately a lot of these bands evolved into what we call funk fusion. Soft Machine went from being very avant-garde jazz, very hypnotic, Terry Riley influences, into basically a funk fusion band, and That's where a lot of prog rock basically died in the mid-70s, and transformed into what Yes were doing in the 80s and Genesis were doing in the 80s, trying to keep in touch with what other bands were doing, like the Stranglers and heaps of magazine, quirky bands that were out there that basically formed from the punk thing. So it's quite a hard thing to get your head around. Pink Floyd gets categorised as psychedelic, space rock. Pink Floyd they're a category on their own. There's a lot of blues influences in Pink Floyd. There's a lot of jazz, and the electronic element of Pink Floyd is something that they developed on their own. The pulse, the driving bass, no one had done that before. Pink Floyd did it. They weren't influenced by the Beatles. They did this stuff at the same time. It's true that the Beatles Tomorrow Never Knows, with the way the studio overdubs of all the instruments and the drones, did have an influence, and for me that's seminal psychedelia, that track, and it's permeated right through all of progressive rock. Even something like Strawberry Fields would have a big influence on Genesis. Anyhow, take a read of this book. Totally recommended.